Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening to the Baker Institute, to this special event that we're having this evening to hear Robert Kapp, the president of the U.S. China Business Council, speak on American corporate values and Chinese society. Bob has very nicely agreed to take questions and get into a dialogue with you following his presentation. Bob has an outstanding curriculum vitae, and I'm not going to go through all of it because it is in your program. But his talk is the first of the East Asian lecture series this fall at the Baker Institute. The three talks in this series all focus on the important role that culture plays in economic social change. Bob will talk about the ways that foreign corporations influence Chinese society through their values and culture. Wei Ming Tu, professor of philosophy at Harvard and director of the Harvard Yenching Institute, will talk this coming Saturday, about the relationship between Asian values and the economic crisis in Asia. And Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, one of the great leaders of Southeast Asia, will also talk about cultural values and the economic crisis in Asia. The senior minister has communicated to me that he will talk about Asian meltdown. He will speak in the Rice Grant Hall on October 23. So if you are here and wish to hear Lee Kuan Yew, we welcome you to attend all of these events that are coming up in the next week. These talks are just part of a major initiative by the Baker Institute's Transnational China Project to open up research and discussion on the way that radical changes, economic changes in Asia, are changing Chinese culture and values. Next March, we will be hosting I believe, path-breaking major research conference bringing together scholars from China, PRC from Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the United States to find new ways to study the cultural foundations of property rights in Chinese societies. In future years, the Transnational China Project will continue to form new networks of scholars and practitioners studying these issues, and we look forward to bringing them here to Houston to share their expertise with you. We also invite you to explore the multilingual website which has been created for the Transnational China Project, which is rapidly becoming a visible archive of resources on these issues. We've had over 11,000 visitors or hits in the first 5 months, and there's more than 18 megabytes of text and images. I was so impressed by this website that was created by our people here, Steve Lewis, our project coordinator, and his colleagues, that I've given a command to the Baker Institute staff that we have to imitate the Transnational China website because it's just fantastic. Bob Kapp is, as I stated, president of the U.S. China Business Council, which is the principal organization of American businesses engaged with the People's Republic of China. You will note in his bio that he served as president of the Washington Council of International Trade. He was executive director of the Washington State China Relations Council, and concurrently with his position at the Washington Council on International Trade. He graduated from Swarthmore. He received his master's and doctoral degrees from Yale. His advanced training was in East Asian Studies and History. And, of course, most importantly in all of this is that from 1970 to 1980, he taught modern Chinese history here at Rice University. And you could say that's the only thing that counts in your, your bio, Bob, here. So he's published a number of scholarly studies in modern Chinese history, and I will not go through all his accomplishments in this field. He played a leading role in carrying out non-governmental supporting activities in conjunction with the APEC ministerial meetings, which convened in Seattle in November 1993. Bob is a superb example of a man of ideas, a scholar who has entered into the field of public policy. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and the Contemporary Affairs Committee on International economic policy. Please join me in welcoming Bob Kapp to our forum. Thank you.
Ed, thanks very much. This lectern is extremely high-tech, but a little low level. I presume the mic is close enough to my mouth that I can be heard, and I hope that's all right. I'm very glad to be here. In many ways, I wish it had been 1970 to 1980 that I was on the faculty at Rice, but as my friends who remember me from then know, it was 3 very short years. I arrived in 1970, fresh out of graduate school, and it was my transition into a life of relative adulthood. And by 1973, I had decided to move on to Seattle, where I then spent 20 years, first of all at the University of Washington. I am a lapsed academic. It's up to others to determine whether I'm an intellectual or not, but it's certainly true that in my work at the U.S. China Business Council, I find that it is very helpful to me to have had a background in the study of modern Chinese affairs, the whole span of Chinese affairs, but particularly modern Chinese affairs. And in my work on behalf of the nearly 300 member companies in our council, I find many, many opportunities, particularly in congressional testimony and sometimes in the media, to try to help Americans who in some cases have very strong feelings about China to get a little bit better sense of the context, the Chinese context in which Americans must also operate if we're going to have a decent relationship with China. The subject of this series, and I must say I'm abashed to be linked or lumped with Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew and with Du Wei-ming, whom I've known for a long time, and each of whom is of far greater distinction than I. But the themes and the subjects to be explored in this marvelous Baker Institute project are very close to my heart. I find that over the long now span of my involvement with China, which began almost 35 years ago, that the questions of how the realities of one society are translated not only linguistically but in a more almost in a nonverbal way to people in the other society, that is the most stimulating part of the work that I've done for a long time. And Rich Smith and you, Ed, and the Institute are to be congratulated for putting together something so creative and so far-reaching in its implications. It's also wonderful that Ford and PricewaterhouseCoopers have come to the support of this program. These are both very fine members of our council, and I'm glad to see that in addition to supporting our council, which is very worthwhile, they're doing something very important down here as well. I want to speak to you tonight without notes. I think so much about these topics that I'm going to ramble a little in the hopes that it will stimulate some discussion afterwards. And first, since this is a university and we're always looking for good things to read, I want to recommend to you a book. If this subject, this broad subject of this series and of this program is of interest to you, let me offer my colleague Richard Madsen some free advertising. You must read China and the American Dream, A Moral Inquiry by Richard Madsen, who is a professor at the University of California, San Diego in sociology, and the author of this marvelous study published by the University of California Press at Berkeley in 1995. It is absolutely an engrossing look at the investment that Americans have made in China, particularly post-Cultural Revolution China, the emotional and cultural investment which they made, particularly in the 80s, and at the shock to the American investment, which was the result of Tiananmen. And it's also a fascinating look at the way in which the American arrival in China after 1978 in particular made its mark upon China and on Chinese people, not only in positive but also in very troubling and in problematic ways. I just can't recommend it to you highly enough. I reread it or re-glance at it every few months because every time I look at it, it reminds me of some new angle of approach that helps me in my own thinking. Let me start by dismissing a couple of things up front. there are Americans battle, and Ed knows this better than anybody else. The Americans battle over the pragmatic and the idealistic dimensions of our national personality in the world. And nowadays, people say the pragmatic side is, well, they say the idealistic side is Wilson, and then you think, well, people will balance that off with somebody from the early 20th century, but no, they say, no, the pragmatic side is Kissinger. Wilson versus Kissinger. And there is a battle that's been going on forever about whether or not the American position in the world is defined principally in national interest terms, crude terms of where the oil is and where the tanks are, and how many divisions people have, or whether the American role in the world lies in a series of ideas more than territory, a series of ideas that many would claim to be universal. Most Americans believe, I think, most Americans I won't even start drawing distinctions. Most Americans, I think, would probably believe that the real meaning of the United States lies in a series of ideas that were embodied in the framing documents of the country. Those ideas came from a time when the values that were developed were said to be universal. And the question that arises for Americans is whether, if you have universal values, you are betraying those values if you do not seek to have them realized universally. In other words, if you've got universal values, then is it not your duty to make sure through national policy that those values are realized and brought to fruition and understood and accepted universally? Well, of course, that's when we get into trouble, and I don't want to spend the whole evening on that, but as you get into Asian values and you hear from Lee Kuan Yew and even Du Wei-ming, you will have, I'm sure, very carefully and thought through and experienced and articulate expositions of the view that there are other systems of values that need to be accepted for their own dignity and in their own greatness. But Americans argue about that, and as I do my work for the U.S. China Business Council in Washington, some of it with the Congress, but even with the executive branch, one is always up against the question of whether or not it is our relationship with China is rooted in a national purpose, an American national purpose, which is the extension of our values to China, or as some people might put it, the enlargement of the sphere of democracy around the world, and so forth. I take a rather humble view of that, and I particularly with regard to business, which is assaulted on the grounds that it has no concern for values, and all it wants to do is squeeze money out of poor, ignorant populations around the world, instead of taking part in the great American enterprise of the delivery of American values. My answer is that in an overt and missionarizing sense, it is not the role of American business, and I would argue personally not the role of the United States, although some of you might disagree with me, to march forth and to deliver, and to think that it would do any good, to deliver as a matter of conscious intent values, even if all Americans could ever agree with what American values were, to the unwashed peoples of the world, certainly including the Chinese. And I take a rather militant stand on that. It is not the business of American business to go and teach the unenlightened Chinese American values in an explicitly missionarizing way. So let me just get that out of the way. I mean, if I were and Rice University is sort of special in this regard. I mean, I suspect we're not going to get into a huge argument about that. There are many parts of the United States where we could probably have a bloody battle throughout the evening on that subject. Having said that, however, the fact is that the Chinese themselves decided in 1978, I mean, that they were going to engage with the world. Do you know that in 1976, during his last period of exile and disgrace, Deng Xiaoping was denounced for having a foreign slave mentality. How many of you are from the PRC? You all remember. Deng, if you're old enough, many of you are not old enough, but some of you are old enough. Deng was denounced for having what was translated a foreign slave mentality. Here's an example of Deng's alleged foreign slave mentality. It was said in '76 that Deng had said, you know, the Germans build very good ships. And if we want to build better ships, perhaps we can learn something from the Germans. And for that, he was excoriated and reviled because it meant that he was selling out the Chinese national dignity and blindly worshiping foreign things. Because he said, we can learn from the Germans. Well, Deng got back to power after the fall of the leadership of the Cultural Revolution and after the death of Mao, and he looked around at the rubble of Chinese society and the anarchy and the utter confusion. Du Weiming has written a great article in an issue of Daedalus magazine on social suffering. He's written a very interesting article on the wreckage that was left behind after the Cultural Revolution. I hope he alludes to it in his remarks. Deng and his colleagues, survivors, looked around at the rubble of this society in which people had to be taught again that it was okay to say good morning, that you wouldn't be destroyed for your bourgeois and uncommunist ideology if you were polite to people. And Deng and his colleagues decided a couple of things. One was that the rest of the world was getting away from China farther and farther. The gap was growing, not shrinking. And that for that reason, China needed to begin to introduce elements of the market economy. The second was that China needed to re-engage with the outside world. In March of '78, I'll never forget it, there was a national science conference. All the bedraggled scientists and intellectuals who came back from the countryside, having been out there doing backbreaking physical labor, or those who survived, that is. The scientific personnel came back to Beijing. They went to this national science conference, and Deng got in there and said, look, China can take great pride in its scientific contributions. We have the 4 great inventions, which are, everybody, compass, paper, gunpowder, printing, right? But, said Deng, we cannot, as a nation and as a people and as a society, we cannot sit and look back on that for all time. Science is a global heritage. We contribute to it. We should draw from it. And what he was saying to the scientific elite of China, such as it was after this terrible period, was it's okay to subscribe to a foreign scientific journal. You're not going to be thrown in jail for it. It's okay to correspond with somebody at Columbia. You're not going to be denounced. It's okay to go overseas to a conference. You're not going to find that you've been, relegated to the fields and the paddies again. The Chinese decided in 1978 and thereafter to engage with the rest of the world, and it doesn't require gunboats and American missionaries to understand that the Chinese are now engaged in a cultural transference process with the industrialized world, and particularly with the United States. They asked for it. We're there because they said, we want you there. So at one level, I try to assure our friends who get so upset about the fact that America is not delivering values sort of at the point of a gun or at the point of a trade sanction to China. I try to reassure them about the fact that the Chinese themselves have committed to this enormous process of engagement with us and with the rest of the world, in which cultural exchange and cultural influence is just so obvious that it hardly needs elaboration. Now, the simplest forms, of course, and the easy ones that make it into the newspapers and the magazines are the consumer trends. I had dinner just before coming down here with a new and very talented member of the Chinese embassy. We had a lovely dinner, first time we'd really sat and talked, and I told him I was coming down to give this talk. And he started off on the fact that his kids only want to buy American goods. And in fact, goods can be made in China. Mostly they are made in China. But in fact, they've got the American brand name on them, the blue jeans, the whatever it is, the sunglasses, the hats, the hamburgers, the canned drinks. I mean, there's this kind of America, as the Chinese would say, this sort of the term means hot. It means a boom. The Japanese call it a boom, an America boom, which sweeps across consumers in China, and we don't really have to spend much time on that either, because that's not what really this program is about. But it is not insignificant. For one thing, if you work for Coca-Cola, it's not insignificant, or Pepsi, or McDonald's, or a lot of other American consumer goods companies. Someone once told me that Guangdong province alone was the second largest world market for Head & Shoulders shampoo. But so, I mean, these things are not without significance in terms of numbers of people, numbers of purchases, numbers of dollars, and wealth created, and people employed, and so forth and so on. But that's not really the core of what Rich Smith and his colleagues, Leo Lee and others, and Ed here at the Institute are getting at in this program. What they're really getting at is the ways in which, through the expansion of commercial relations between our two countries in particular, although it could be said about the world as a whole, our two countries in particular, culture and ideas and patterns merge or move and are established in new places. Let me also put another one to rest rather quickly. This will not, I think, make some of our Chinese friends terribly happy, and it's something that Dick Madsen writes about in his wonderful book. Most of the flow these days, whether we like it or not, is from the West to China. There's just no getting around the fact that the United States is not drinking up worldviews, patterns of human relations, forms of industrial organization, concepts of property, and so forth from China at this time. This is painful for many people in China, and I will borrow from Madsen's ideas here. Madsen points out that in the early years of the U.S. China engagement after 1972, in the period of great sort of enthusiastic rush into each other's embrace again, there was, partly as a result of the ideology of the Cultural Revolution, there was a very strong feeling in China that this was a truly two-way giving of influences by both countries, and that China was proud of many aspects of what it had accomplished and what it had learned and what it had drawn from its enormous and magnificent past, as well as its revolutionary present, and that it had those to offer to the West and to the United States, even as the Americans had, technology and so forth and so on. I think for now, though, and it has been painful for many in China to come to terms with this. I think the measurable flows are primarily from this society in that direction, and that is a function of principally of the relative levels of economic development involved, and to some extent of the tremendous flow of Chinese students and scholars and others to the United States, people who in many cases have brought what they've learned and what they've gathered back into Chinese life. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on, even in the interest of sort of face and diplomacy, on an analysis of the flows of ideas and influence and so forth that come to the United States from China tonight. There certainly are some in the world of scholarship, but at the level of popular culture or the structures of everyday life, as somebody once called it, in American life, I think it's premature to say that China is having a profound influence on American society at this time. So what's left is the core. And here I want to take a few examples. A couple of years ago, in the annual debate over normal trade relations with China, the maintaining of the standard tariffs on Chinese imports that we collect on goods from virtually every other country around the world, we had a new Congress in Washington, and we began to get the message from some of these newly arrived figures and some of their more senior colleagues. Look, we don't want to hear about jobs. We don't want to hear about markets. We don't want to hear about trade. We don't want to hear about business. What we want to hear about is values. And you American businesses have got to, if you want to have a normal trade relationship with China as approved by our Congress, you've got to prove to us that American business in China is not guilty of betraying American values. So we all rushed out to show that we were good guys. And actually, it turned out pretty well. That is to say, we in our council, others did the same, although I think we probably did it more intensively. We told our companies, all right, tell us what you are doing that is socially constructive and ethically defensible and in accord with deep-seated American values and deep-seated American hopes in China. And we got a massive range of responses. Now, they tended to show two things. One, there are substantial, not enormous, but substantial American corporate charitable efforts in China. They tend to have a business development dimension to them. That is, you do something which is charitable and be in the hopes that you'll get recognized for it and that your company will smell better. But that's there. The other thing, though, is the more important, and that is, as you look at what the company said to us in response, you discover the training programs, the development of workforce, not only shop floor workforce, but managerial workforce, the opening up of information access to people in China who would never, ever, ever have it otherwise, the housing programs helping, at least in some particular companies' cases, helping Chinese employees through corporate-based financing to purchase and own their own dwelling places, long before the PRC central government decided to move in the same direction last spring, and on and on and on. That is, companies in the course of doing business there, for their own interests, out of their own self-interests, sought to develop in China a series of changes in the ordinary, normal pattern of Chinese activity that were good for business, good for the companies, but also good for society and good for the people associated with those companies in China. It was not easy work, but that opened the door to what I really need to try to get at tonight. The ways in which American company presence in China, and we're really primarily here talking about companies that invest in China, establish production there, hire people, and so forth. The ways in which the American corporate presence in China, initiated by the Chinese after all, welcomed by the Chinese, they wrote the joint venture laws, they said we want you, are having an influence, lie in the realm, first of all, of the bringing of fairly standardized American corporate norms and systems of management and production into China. The Chinese call this technology, and they call it management, and it's true. The American companies come to China, and they do not. I mean, they are committed to living within Chinese law, of course. This is not the 1890s anymore. You don't march into another country, with your gunboats and say, we are exempt from your laws. Those days are over. And American multinationals make a big point about the fact that they are committed to living under the law of whatever country that they're operating in. But in fact, having said that, they then bring with them, for example, the labor market. The ability to hire and fire is absolutely critical for American companies in the course of normal conduct of a market-based economic enterprise. Now, China did not have a labor market in 1978. Everybody was fun pay. How many of you were fun pay? Are you old enough to be fun pay? What is fun pay? The government told you where you'd go to school, normally told you what you would study. You study French, you're a biologist. How about that? And you are an accountant. I mean, and when you got out, you were fun paid to a job. And if you were lucky, you got fun paid to Shanghai or Beijing. But if you were unlucky, you got fun paid to, Inner Mongolia or Hunan or someplace, and spent the rest of your life writing to your relatives back home. And that was it. And then your kid, if he was lucky, inherited your job at the end of your useful life, in the ball bearing factory. There was no labor market. There was no looking for work. There was no advertising for workers. And American companies in particular, industrialized countries as a whole, but American companies certainly, came into China, and right from the start, they were up against the system, and it was their desire to operate in a labor market. How many of you who are from China have already been involved in the American labor market, like looked for work? Anybody look for work yet? You're all students? Well, you will look for work, you will, and you'll get work, because somebody will be looking for you as well. But all of that was unknown to a post-cultural revolutionary China, and even to a Maoist China going back all the way to the beginning of the People's Republic. So that's just a simple example. Now, along with that, of course, the arrival of the foreign companies in China at the invitation of the Chinese, because the Chinese needed the capital, they needed the technology if they were ever going to raise the country out of poverty and begin to close the income and wealth disparity between China and the rest of the world. It was accompanied, of course, by a constant and shifting and sometimes moving forward, sometimes moving backward program of Chinese social and economic reforms initiated domestically by the Chinese government. For example, in fact, the regime did away over time with one of the absolutely bedrock policies of the Maoist era, and that was the fact that you weren't allowed to move from where you were. If you were classified as rural, you were not allowed to physically remove yourself to a city. Not that many people in the cities would voluntarily head for the countryside, but there was a system in place as a social control and political control system in place by the mid-50s, in which your place, your registration of household location and so forth was on the books, and it was not changed. Now, you can't have a labor market a la Americaine. You can't have a labor market if you don't have the ability for people to, in fact, move around. The Chinese went about undoing the Hukou system. It's largely gone now. And so as the need to create an investment environment compatible with and conducive to the bringing in of the vital foreign capital, the vital technology, the vital production capabilities that would permit China to become a world exporting nation, to raise its living standards and so forth and so on. As the process of improving the investment environment, the business environment for foreign business proceeded, the Chinese were engaged at the central government level in a series of domestic reforms which have gone deeper and deeper. Do we cause all of those? No. No. Can we say, thanks to American private enterprise, people now can move from one city to another? Not exactly. It isn't so simple. And, if I may use poor Congress as a stalking horse again, or as a whipping boy again, in Congress, it's nice to be able to show that we told somebody to do something, and they did it because we told them to. Now, the first two parts are relatively easy. You can always say, we told them to do it. That's pretty easy. And you can even say, they did it. The hard part is getting them to say they did it because you told them to, which most other people don't like to do. And that's, when you go home to the voters, unless you have that crucial third link there, it's sometimes a little hard. But can we say, we told the Chinese that this system of binding people to a physical location and never letting them move is wrong, and it's tyranny, and it's politically oppressive, and they should get rid of it, and they did because we told them to? No. But the fact is that in order to create an environment of global engagement necessary to China's own salvation, and China's own resurrection, and China's own survival, in fact, these domestic policies are changing, and they are changing in ways which are compatible with the needs of American companies. Let me give you another example. Law. I have always been skeptical about the term rule of law as a sort of magic wand that you can wave around and solve the problems of a society. And I used to take a little bit of umbrage when someone like Tom Friedman in the Washington Post would write a story crudely linking the fate of certain Chinese political dissidents who were in terrible travail with the cancellation of the McDonald's lease at the corner of Wang Fujing and Chang'anjie, the random cancellation of a lease that McDonald's had duly signed for a very profitable McDonald's location right at the corner of the two busiest streets in Beijing, on the grounds that both of these tragedies, the tragedy of McDonald's losing its lease and the tragedy of certain people languishing in jail in Qinghai, were in fact mirror manifestations of the absence of the rule of law. I thought, that's kind of crude, come on, don't be. But in fact, in some ways, there's something to it. American business and all global business has got to function in an environment of broadly understood, predictable, impartially administered, and transparently arrived at, that is knowable, norms and even laws, which determine who has the authority to control and to control what, to tell people to do what are the consequences of this action, and this action. Now, China has a grand cultural tradition in which formal law was never regarded well. Law was the last resort of a failed society. When you had to revert to law, Rich Smith can give you this far better than I. When you had to revert to formal law, it meant that the society had essentially failed, and the compulsion of the state had to be invoked in the form of tyranny. Indeed, law was primarily punishments. There is no particular tradition in China of the legal definitions of the limits of the power of the state. In fact, it doesn't exist at all. So the need of Western companies for a legal environment in which they could operate with some sense of security and certainty ran up against deeply seated traditions to the contrary, and against more recent traditions to the contrary, namely that the Communist Party is superior to everything else. That is, in Marxism, as you know, law is part of the state, and the state is the superstructure of a class system, and above all of that, there stood, according to Marxism and Leninism in particular, the vanguard of the proletariat, namely the party, which was really above law. The Chinese still have not dealt with that question formally, and it remains one of the great unanswered challenges for I think the near-term future in China. Nevertheless, within 6 months or eight or 10 months of that conference in which Deng Xiaoping said it's okay to subscribe to foreign science journals, let's re-engage with the world. Within a year or so after that, anyway, they'd come out with their first joint venture law, and since the joint venture law of 1979, China has proceeded to erect, with remarkable speed, when you think about the size of the endeavor, a structure of laws designed to create an economic environment in which both domestic and international business can function. Is it complete? No. Is it fully implemented? No, sir. And Americans have continual, ongoing problems with the distinction between law on the books and reality on the ground. There are endless problems. But the fact is that it was the need to create an environment conducive to the functioning of vital international economic activity within China and commercial activity that has, to some extent at least, driven the erection of this massive edifice of laws, which is still going on in the PRC. In that regard, let me just digress for a minute about a little project of our council, which in a tiny way will, we hope, contribute usefully to this continuing development of stable and predictable, and we hope equitable legal institutions in China. President Clinton and President Jiang, at the time of the summit in October '97, signed a statement, and one of the elements of the statement was a pledge that the two countries would cooperate in the field of law. The minute I read that, I knew that we were going to have to raise some private money, because, as you may know, the United States has a regrettable tradition of agreeing to important things and then not paying for them. I could list thousands of them, or at least several of them right now, but we would get into partisan politics, and I won't do that. So suffice it to say that U.S. China cooperation in the field of law is not funded by the U.S. government. The president signed on the dotted line with the president of China, and one could reasonably assume that when the president of a great nation's government puts his name to paper, that the government of that country is going to devote resources to the realization of what has been signed about. But most of us know better, and lo and behold, even the pitiful $5 million that was requested by the president to implement the rule of law, the legal cooperation program with China, through the instrumentality of the Asia Foundation, to be specific, which is partially funded by the Congress, that was taken out of the budget. It was taken out of the appropriations bills. There's no federal money to help in the U.S. China legal cooperation field, despite the fact that we're on paper in the name of our president to do it, and despite the fact that it is an area of human endeavor which can be profoundly important to the betterment, long-term betterment of relations between the two countries. So, I hit up our companies, and in a very small way, we've created a fund called the U.S. China Legal Cooperation Fund, and we're going to try to do some very small grants to help some of these programs go forward. But here again, in the area of law, one gets into basic structures of another society. It is not our job to tell the Chinese that their securities and exchange law has to look just like ours. The Chinese, to their great credit, considering that they're supposed to be so culturally isolated and so proud and arrogant and never willing to listen to any other culture, to their enormous credit, the Chinese are intensely inquisitive about other countries' legal systems and extremely thorough in seeking out what there is in other countries that can be borrowed and adjusted and adapted to the realities, the intractable realities of Chinese society. In that sense, again, the business engagement with China is part of a very important process that is leading to social and institutional change in China. Again, companies don't go over to China. People sometimes say that what a company should really do in China is go into the Chinese offices with whom they must work and say, unless you do the following things, unless your central government does the following things that comport with our deep-seated American values, we refuse to do business with you. And American companies don't do that, and they would be foolish if they tried. But in this process of acting like businesses, there is underway, with the willing complicity of the Chinese. I mean, they're the ones who are driving this in many ways. There is this massive process of intellectual transference and, in some cases, institutional change going on in China. Now, does it mean that China is, coming out just like us? Dick Madsen writes about that feeling of American optimism in the 1970s. We were so depressed after Vietnam. We were beginning to, we had riots on our own streets. There was a lot going on back here that made us doubt, perhaps, some of the strength of our own institutions. And then Nixon went to China, and pretty soon it looked to us like China was going to be just like us. That permitted us to reaffirm our own sort of sense of confidence in our own institutions. Should we today look at China and say, it's happening at last, China's going to be just like us? No, of course not. And indeed, China is not without its internal debates and conflicts about the nature of this institutional change, which is partly a function of the advent of foreign influence and partly a function of the continuing decisions that this leadership is making, going deeper and deeper and deeper into the structures of China's own society. I recently, let me commend to you a review in the New York Review of Books 2 issues ago. The cover review. It's called A Great Leap Backward, ? And it's a review of a book recently printed in China by a woman named He Qinglian. The review is by a Princeton professor named Perry Link and a Chinese scholar and journalist who is based at Princeton named Liu Binyan. The book, which I have in my briefcase, in fact, I've been reading it as I travel. The book is about some of the bad side effects of the reform programs of the last 20 years. I mean, we're 20 years into the Deng Xiaoping reforms now, and all has not been sweetness and light. It is true that people can move from countryside to city. It's true that there's much more of a labor market. It's true that there are many more ways to make money now. It's true that you're no longer told you're an accountant and you're an economist and you're a biologist and you're an astrophysicist and you're a factory worker. Many things have changed, and we would say for the better. But it's also true that a lot of things have become very problematic in China. For example, inequalities of wealth are now extreme and getting worse. Corruption is rampant. Crime has risen in waves, but has risen to enormous levels in some cases. China's got lots of social problems, and as those social problems roil and affect people's sense of security and well-being, there are voices which argue that the reform programs themselves are at fault and need to be retreated from. China, last spring, the leadership in China decided finally to take on the question of the state-owned enterprises, these giant government-owned institutions, productive institutions, vastly overstaffed, money losing at a horrific rate, living on loans from government banks which would never be repaid, endangering the whole banking system of the country, turning out mountains of goods that were useless and could not be sold and were of terrible quality. The regime under the new Premier Zhu Rongji decided that it was time to really try to do something about this, permitting firms to go bankrupt, developing new forms of ownership, spinning them off to stock markets and letting people buy shares. and to basically undo most of the state-owned enterprises, let them fall, or let them survive as profit-making institutions if they could. Along the way, as many as 100 million people's jobs are at stake. This is not a small matter. This is, as I said in Congress, base closing to about the 100th power. And as people confront these spin-off effects of these reforms which must be undertaken and that so many people understand need to be undertaken, they sometimes think, uh-oh, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe we need to step back here. The presence of the foreign business community in China sometimes gets wrapped up in that. There is always in China a powerful nativist, culturally conservative, and even xenophobic intellectual stratum and political stratum. The revolution which brought the Chinese communists to power was a revolution against foreign domination. The same voice that accused Deng Xiaoping of having a foreign slave mentality because he thought shipbuilding might be learned from the Germans, that voice is never entirely eliminated from Chinese life. If you read the book Crossed Swords that was published this year, Jiao Feng, you can read, published in China, I might say, a fascinating account of 3 different battles between the intellectual and political conservatives in the society and the more reformist elements of the society, including latterly Jiang Zemin himself, on vital issues since '78, in which really there was a tremendous battle about whether to move forward toward greater openness, as the Chinese call it, or whether to close the doors intellectually and politically and culturally and retreat. American business does get caught up in that. It is not inconceivable to me that from time to time there will be a reaction against the very influences that American business carries with it into China. Not because we proselytize and demand that people change their minds about their views of the world, but because in the conducting of an American business enterprise on basically American standards in China, there are values and behavioral patterns that go with it. And there may be times in the future when voices within China say, look, this is too far. We've gone too far. We've opened the door too much. Not only do we get, a production technology, but we also get the internet with all that pornography, and we get we get the Star Report in Chinese the next day on the Guangzhou Zhibao website, translated overnight in Taiwan, and on the Canton Daily website the next day. I mean, enough already. Let's try to sort of shut the doors and keep these polluting influences at a distance. You remember spiritual pollution not too long ago in China. You remember bourgeois liberalization. There is a segment of the Chinese political spectrum there as here. I might say the mirror images are surprisingly close. There is a segment of the political spectrum there which rises up in defense of Chinese values. Sounds familiar? And argues that the society is being polluted by the undue advent of foreign influences. But at the end of the day, the leadership knows, and in fact most of the society knows, that the engagement with the world cannot be avoided now and shouldn't be avoided, and that that economically the future of China lies in integration with the global economy, and that means foreign investment. That means the establishment of foreign enterprises in China. That means the continued improvement of the business environment for foreign companies, including American companies. And that means living with and managing and somehow adjusting to some of the influences that arrive on the shoulders of foreign companies. So it isn't perfect. And the influences that Americans bring to China are mediated and transformed on the ground in China. Obviously, you're foolish if you pretend that you're living in Cincinnati when you're living in Changsha. I mean, it's not the same place, and no matter how much you want to run your company just like an American company, you can't operate in total isolation from the society and the social traditions and the material conditions of the people with whom you're conducting your operation in country. But I really feel that in these ineffable ways, it's not a function of sitting down and teaching people. It's not a function of telling them that they must do A, B, and C, that in fact there is a very substantial cultural interchange going on that we should take some quiet pride in. We don't, I think, have to trumpet it. I think that the impulse in Washington to have a report about everything is regrettable. You know, the president shall report every year the following achievements that we have accomplished in whatever field is under discussion. It's not that we should have an annual list of the ways in which American business has transformed China, because frankly the Chinese are legitimately, I mean, everybody has a right to be proud. The Chinese have a very strong right to be proud of their society and their culture and their traditions and their dignity, and they do not take kindly to be simply to being regarded simply as the sort of test market for American influences and ideas. So it's not a question of advertising all the time that, you know, we have accomplished the following things, that, you know, that thanks to the American business presence in China, the following things have happened. But in fact, there is a lot that I think has happened constructively, and I think most of the Chinese who have experienced those changes would, if they were not forced to say, "Oh, thank you, America. Oh, thank you, America," they would, in fact, agree that these changes are positive and that Chinese life is better because of the engagement. So it's a fascinating process. We're all part of it, there are undesirable and difficult parts of it. The international business presence in China, not primarily American, I would say, but it has resulted in the creation of certain labor exploiting industries within China, exporting to third country markets in which working conditions are sometimes terrible. Labor abuses are not unknown. Again, I think the Americans are not principally directly the perpetrators of these exploitative conditions, although they sometimes work through subcontractors who behave very badly. There are downsides, but by and large, I think both Americans and Chinese would agree that the presence, that China's decision to integrate economically with the world and to encourage American and foreign companies to become part of the Chinese economy has been a constructive one for both countries. Thanks very much, and I'd love to have some time to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Bob will entertain questions or comments from the audience, please.
Of the state-owned industries, what portion is made up by those companies owned by the Army, People's Liberation Army, and how do they compare to the other state-owned companies, and do you see them actually truly being divested?
Lots of questions in one. The People's Liberation Army, and first of all, there are some distinctions to make between the Army and the Defense Ministry, but the military in the broadest sense has always obviously had certain productive enterprises in China. The military equipment factories are owned by the military. The armaments factories are owned by the state, either by the PLA or by the Defense Ministry. But with the advent of reforms after 1978, the modernization of the military was put at the back end of the train, and the Chinese leadership made a decision to, since they were not spending a lot of money out of the central government budget, or as much money as military modernization might need, they permitted the military units to begin to make money on their own, and the result has been the development of a large range of economic enterprises which are owned by and which generate income for military units. Now, a lot of these are, you read in the papers what they are. Some of them are karaoke bars and hotels, lots of hotels, and other kinds of very commercial enterprises. Some are more clearly technologically oriented, or in fact industrial, and some are conversions of military plants to civilian and commercial product uses. I mean, one of the things that the Chinese tried to do, and which for a time at least Americans felt they ought to be encouraged to do, was to take military plants that used to make tanks and turn them into motorcycle plants selling motorcycles commercially. I use a specific case from Chongqing, but actually the United States Department of Defense was very strong, as a matter of national policy, worked hard for a while to try to assist the Chinese in the difficult process of taking big military plants that in fact were really no longer needed even for the maintenance of the kind of army that the Chinese were moving away from, and turn them over to the production of civilian goods because we felt that was part of the demilitarization, you might say, of Chinese society. What has happened is that the regime now finds that the pursuit of commercial gain by people of military identity has become a control problem and a corruption problem. And actually that they've created a kind of a monster here which they have difficulty getting under control. If the existential interests of military organizations are more heavily tied to their ability to run profitable hotels or brothels or chewing gum factories, a random example, not an example, but an imagined example, then they are by maintaining military readiness and operating within the tight disciplinary structures of the government of which they are the military arm, the government's got a problem. The military involved in vast amounts of smuggling because they bring goods in for their commercial purposes. I mean, it is rife throughout the society, and some of you who live in China will know better than I how far that goes. What is the extent of the Chinese, broadly speaking, and there are some very good papers on this that will go into greater detail. James Mulvenon's paper from Rand Corporation makes some very good distinctions here. But if you lump the National Defense Ministry structures and the PLA structures all together, what is the extent of their ownership of the Chinese economy? No one knows. I certainly don't know. And when people in the Congress suggest that we should ban imports from PLA-owned factories, they don't know either, and we would have to have 100,000 customs agents in China tracking down the details of ownership of enterprises to determine whether the shoelace eyelets in this pair of shoes was made by a government, by a militarily connected shoelace eyelet factory or not. So the simple answer to how much they own, I don't have the slightest idea. There are some papers that try to estimate it. The question of whether the military can be gotten out of business, now that the regime itself has concluded that this is in a way a threat to national security and certainly a source of enormous corruption in the economy, I think it remains to be seen. You know, the Chinese have a great, lengthy tradition of a nominal change without substantive change. You take people out of uniform, you say they're no longer military, and I think there's a lot of skepticism in China. The Chinese call this 有名无实. It has the name, but it doesn't have the reality. I think there's skepticism in China that this deeply entrenched, highly profitable activity on which lives depend, and kids schooling and people's old age security and so forth, can be simply erased with the stroke of a pen. One of the things the Chinese would have to do would be to start paying more money out of the national budget to get it done. And there's some evidence that they're trying to make deals, that Beijing is trying to cut deals with key military leaders and even key provincial military structures now to do that. I mean, it has been said that one particular senior leader on the Chinese military side has put a dollar figure, or at least a renminbi figure, on what it will cost the central government treasury to get the military to turn ownership over to others. It's not going to be clean, and it's not going to be short term. And the Chinese, I think, happily know they've got a problem there. I had a man tell me at one of the military think tanks about 2 years ago that this wave of military commercialism was going to come to an end because the leadership had wakened up to the fact that it was ultimately disastrous for them and for their military effectiveness itself, and that it was only a matter of time. So we'll just have to see. Let me go to the back of the room, and then I'll work forward. Yeah. Yes, sir. 戴眼镜的.
I just want to ask, what percentage of America's export is to China, or important is China as American business?
China, China is not one of America's, well, China is, I think, our fifth biggest trading partner, fourth or fifth, it depends on the year. But as you know well, in dollar terms, and talking only about merchandise, that is goods you can hold in your hands, China sells far more in dollar value terms to us than we sell to China. So and of course the Chinese economy is much smaller than the American economy. So the American market for Chinese goods represents a much higher percentage of China's exports to the world than the Chinese market does for American goods. On the other hand, it is not an insignificant market. There are some fields in which even today China is a critical market, and that goes of course for aircraft, but also for certain other products. And the thing that Americans do remember, and correctly so, is that China is as we say, a work in progress. Its growth rates over the past 8 or 10 years, really more than 10 years, have already taken China from a position of negligible foreign trade to an enormous amount of international trade activity. And per capita incomes have risen very rapidly in China. I don't need to rehearse all that back with you, but the point is, American companies look at China not only, and I think Americans as a whole should look at China, not only as an absolute dollar number on a given day today, but as a nation in which we hope the trends will lead in the direction of much greater American commercial opportunities than exist today. Now, that means, however, that China's policies with relationship to international trade are a very, very great concern to us. And the emergence of Chinese, of a modern Chinese economy, which is not open to, whose markets are not open to the world, and whose investment markets are not more fully open, and whose opportunities for the profitable operation of business by foreigners are curtailed, is a very serious matter. In other words, everybody welcomes China's economic growth. Everybody welcomes China's arrival as a trading partner, and certainly Americans have welcomed the arrival of Chinese goods. I mean, we buy them in vast quantities. But there is a quid for the quo that not everybody in China understands. And just as our Chinese friends, I think, are not particularly happy to be referred to as a great market, even though they, I mean, who wants to think of oneself as a market? I mean, that's a sort of a passive and kind of junior partner way of looking at yourself. But the same needs to be understood by our Chinese friends about the United States. The United States is not prepared to and I think too many Chinese still regard the United States in this way. The United States is not prepared to have a relationship with China in which we are principally China's market, and the other side, the other half of the equation doesn't matter. So the percentage of total American trade today and total American exports is not that great. The ranking total of all two-way trade is very high. I mean, if you consider where China was 15 years ago, it's amazing. They're our fifth biggest trading partner. But the crucial issue is, what are the trends for the future? On that, our Chinese friends tend to play a very hard game of encouraging us to bet on the future. We have 1,200,000,000 people, but actions speak louder than words. And in fact, in the last couple of years, American exports to China have been flat. They have grown by 1% or less. American exports to China are not growing at a level that one would expect them to grow. As the Chinese economy grows, Chinese incomes rise, and Chinese exports to the United States expand. Yes, ma'am. I'll come up next.
I can speak. Our company have doing some business in China. I have something noticeable. I like to compare American business to the people in Japan do business in China.
Mm-hmm.
People from Europe do business in China. Can you compare?
Well, I can only tell you what we're told.
That's very interesting. Like, you say the three-border stamp is a big project.
Right.
Because of political reasons, American company cannot bid on the
Right.
project. Something like that.
Right.
But the small European country, they don't care whatever the political reason or whatever. They can fully support a design firm and
Well,
It's kind of awkward. How can we compete?
Americans need to understand that some of our failures, if you will, to grow our exports and our profits with China are best laid at our own doorstep. The fact is that for complex reasons of politics and ideology and economic history, the United States is unwilling at this time to do some things that other countries do. Take, for example, the attitude of any state legislature toward the State Department of Commerce, whatever you call it in the state of Texas. In the state of Washington, it's called the Department of Trade and Economic Development. You will hear many state legislators say, the taxpayers of this state have no business subsidizing the profit-making activities of a small number of companies. Why are we spending money? Why are we spending state money or even sometimes? Why are we giving tax breaks to companies to encourage them to put plants into the state and develop jobs here? There is a great ambivalence in the United States about whether the public and the private sectors should be so completely separate. This really is a sort of a deep social political ideology matter as to whether the public and the private sectors of American life ought to be so separate from one another that the public sector has no business helping business advance itself. It comes out on the Ex-Im Bank. It comes out on the endless battles in Washington about whether or not the United States should strengthen the Ex-Im Bank to help American exporters export. And then there's a deep debate in this country about whether or not international trade and business exists on its own terms in a sort of an ideological vacuum, or whether at the other extreme it is utterly inseparable from other issues of American other normative issues that America faces. The Three Gorges Dam. Here we have this gigantic dam being built by the People's Republic, in which Caterpillar could sell so many bulldozers that the place would run forever. I forget the number of man hours that Caterpillar came up with, but it was something like 12 billion man hours in Peoria making bulldozers for Three Gorges. But to do that effectively, they needed Ex-Im Bank guarantees, and Ex-Im said no because it was decided that the Three Gorges Dam had such grievous implications environmentally and in terms of the fact that the dam, when completed, would cause the removal from their homes and their lands of more than 1 million people as the waters rose behind the dam, that the United States was not going to help. Now, so Caterpillar's out of the picture and we don't get the jobs. I represent the Business Council. Caterpillar's a member. We expressed ourselves very strongly on the subject, but that's a sort of an American consensus question in which obviously this country has many different views, and there are many people who would argue that no, the United States should not be supporting a project which results in the uprooting of 1 million people and causes this tremendous what is expected to be tremendous environmental damage. We shouldn't be behind it as a matter of public policy. We fight those battles a lot more, as you know, than the Japanese. What the Chinese always say to you, of course, because you're in room 112, and the Japanese are in room 114, and the Germans are in room 116, and the Brits are down the hall in 118, all working for the same contract. What the Chinese say to us is, we really like you Americans the best. You're more like us, you have a sense of humor just as we Chinese do, and you Americans are so forthright, and you always say just what's on your mind, and you're not so closed and secretive as those British people down in 118 are, and you never, invaded us and stole our territory and created these terrible atrocities the ways those rats in 116 did only 50 years ago. We really like you the best, but you really don't know how to do business with us. And then the implications of that vary. Sometimes the implications are really not very subtle, that you don't know how to provide bribes appropriately. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The Americans, to a considerable extent, are constrained from forms of corrupt behavior by our standards, which the Japanese and the Europeans are not. And And everybody, you know, and it is a constant challenge for American businesses. And I think for people of Chinese background who are in this country, I can't tell you whether or not it is different if you are whether you're Chinese yourself and an American company. But for non-Chinese companies, and I think really for most American companies, this is a constant problem. First of all, we've got a law which says there are things you're not allowed to do or you'll go to jail. And second of all, it is harder. This country does not run on wheel greasing the way many countries in the world do. So, you know, we hear that from the Chinese a lot, and I don't really have an answer for you. I think on things like financing and tied aid, you know, where government trade finance instruments are made available to facilitate exports, the Europeans and the Japanese do a much better job than we do. Congress is very, very not supportive on that, and we sometimes lose out accordingly.
So we're a bigger country or a European country, you could get that, but I mean, whatever the bid, there was support of a whole group of people.
Yeah.
But here, I guess nobody cares.
Well, it's something on which there's a lot of sort of ideology behind it, and the battle's not over yet. But you're right, it is somewhat different. Ed's got me here. I think we're probably running out of time.
One more question.
We'll take one more, and I'm going to go to the gentleman with his hand up.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Larry Gao. First of all, I would like to commend the excellent job Bob has done as both a mainland Chinese, mainlander, and also as a Yale alum. If I could, I would like to add a few things. To the as example, to the points that you have alluded to. All of which are excellent points, by the way. First thing, you were talking about, the lady was talking about the U.S. And China trade relationship. I believe the simple fact is like this. By the way, I'm a consultant. I've been just finishing a management consulting project in China, so I think I can probably point to some of the examples like what she alluded to. The simple matter of fact is,
don't imitate my tendency to excessive length.
Okay. Well, all right. First of all, answer the latest question. How big is the PLA Army's business? It's about $1.5 billion, which is roughly less than 0.5% of the much less than 0.5% of the Chinese GDP or whatever you call it. It's very small. The reason it's growing is because in the beginning, the Army was honorable place that you can work for. Both you have high pay and a very good position, and later on everything lost. So the government need to subsidize them. Just to allow them to do some business, to get some money. Basically, that was the reason. And now, like you said, it's been cut off, and they're getting privatized. As far as the U.S. China relationship, I think there's a couple of misconceptions amongst the American people. One is that a lot of people believe that we're losing jobs to the Chinese because of the import. As an MBA from University of Chicago, we studied this case. Actually, there are some very excellent authoritative publications on this matter, which says this: the trade, like China-U.S. trade, basically helps promote business and job creations in China, because a dollar of profit made, we U.S. normally kind of business, and normally we are what we call primarily resides in the downstream. We made 85% of them. Look at a pair of Nike shoes which sells for $100. We bought it from China about $10. So basically, that's a huge misconception. On the other hand, the Congress people, many of them politicians, believe that by not exporting some of the higher tech, not necessarily higher tech, technologies to Chinese, we are actually blocking their access to those core technologies, which we are not. And I think the ideology is simple and naive, but we're not really achieving our objectives. Again, thanks so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you very much for letting me go on at such length.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.